Good morning. This is a little Sufi story which those of you who are this is a little Sufi story. Those of you who are concerned with diagnosis, part of your life, will be interested in. Visiting a sick friend, Nasruddin was just in time to see the doctor arrive. Well, the doctor has just arrived. The man was in the house for less than a minute, and the speed of his diagnosis stunned the mullah. First, the doctor looked at the patient's tongue, then he paused briefly. Then he said, "You've been eating green apples. Stop doing this, and you will be well in a couple of days." Forgetting everything else, the mullah pursued the doctor out of the house. "Tell me, doctor," he panted. "Please tell me how you do it." It was quite simple. "When you have experience to distinguish various situations," said the doctor, "you see, as soon as I knew that the man had a stomachache, I looked for a cause. When I got into the sick room, I saw a heap of green apple cores under the man's bed. The rest was obvious." Nasruddin thanked him for the lesson. So, we were talking about awareness. You know, he could have put him through a whole battery of tests. All he needed to do was look under the bed. He told me once, actually, doctor, that the GP he knew used to diagnose diabetes before he sent the patient off for tests. And he would listen to the symptoms, and then he would lick his finger. Well, this would be for men, anyway. Lick his finger and then rub it on the bottom of the man's trouser thing. Yeah? You know why?
Urine droppings.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. For the urine, and then touch it, and if it was too sweet, I suppose, isn't it?
That's how we used to diagnose the taste of urine.
Is that right? Oh, okay.
The other one is ants, isn't it? They used to use in India.
Ants.
Yeah, they put urine in a saucer or on the ground, and
Yeah.
if the ants came to it, it was just
Sweet.
Much cheaper too, isn't it?
Yes.
Doctor just put their finger in it all the time. That's what I used to do.
Yeah.
Taste that sugar.
Amazing. Okay, well, pick up a few tips everywhere. So, where did we end up? So we're still exploring what is health, and we may have discovered it by the end of the week. But I was relating it yesterday. We were talking about the medical definition or medical scientific approach to health, which leaves us all a little bit underwhelmed, you know. So if we take the whole person into account, the common sense whole person into account, then the meaning of health begins to expand from what can be measured or what can be diagnosed even, and we begin to discover some of the significance of the human person, the mystery of the human person, in a greater richness and greater awareness. And so this led us to yesterday to reflect on the meaning of the experience of God. And I was saying that the experience of God is more than we think, just as meditation is not what you think. The experience of God itself is a rather ambiguous expression. Does it mean my experience of God, which is how we would start to think about it? It's how I, Laurence, experience God, as opposed to your experience of God, or maybe we've got similar experiences of God and we can compare them and so on. So there's that sense of the word, of the expression. But the other is that maybe it's God's experience, which is God, or the experience of God, God experiencing, being experienced in me. So it's not my possession, not my experience in the same way as we might say, I eat a green apple and that's my experience of it. And you didn't have that experience because you weren't eating green apples. But it's a different concept of the possessive, really. God's experience, the experience of God happening, occurring in me. But as it occurs in me, it completely changes my sense of who I am for a number of reasons, which we'll look at now and later. And I was speaking about faith. We looked at this idea of God's experiencing in the person in the story of Etty Hillesum, who sort of fell into this great space that she eventually could find no other word for except God, and began to identify or to relate to in a personal way. Then we looked at faith and how faith is more than belief. Faith is our capacity for commitment, personal commitment. We remain faithful to a person, to a promise. And that commitment brings us to transcendence, because we transcend the ego that wants to give up when things get difficult and feels that it's not getting what it wanted. So we transcend something, we transcend the ego, and that transcendence opens us therefore to the gift of self, to be able to give ourselves, which we call love. So the beginning is faith, the end is love, the union of the two is God. And then this also brought us to see how meditation is a way of faith. We persevere with meditation. We meditate every day. We say the mantra continuously during the meditation. That's perseverance, that's commitment. And there are many times when we would prefer to turn over and go back to sleep, as I did this morning, and overslept the meditation. So there are many times that we would like to give up, but we come back to it. We reconnect, and eventually that becomes a good habit. So this morning I overslept, but it would have been an incomplete morning for me if I hadn't done my meditation. Actually did it after breakfast rather than before breakfast this morning. And it wasn't out of a great sense of guilt, it was just a sense of wholeness, a sense of balance. It was the best way, it's the way I begin the day. So eventually this habit, this perseverance, gets ingrained in you and it becomes a good habit. Good habits are not addictions. Good habits are things that by their habituation help you. So an act of faith then has this repetitive quality. It becomes a good habit, like a good marriage can become a good habit. It's tested, and there are inevitably aspects of infidelity in every commitment we make. But by learning to remain faithful and coming back to the commitment when we are unfaithful, this gives us a real insight into forgiveness, then we begin to break through into a transcendence which helps us to understand the nature of love in relation to faith. So we saw yesterday a little bit about how meditation is a way of faith, and anyone who describes why they meditate are not going to describe it in terms of, paranormal or psychic events that happen. There will be people who start meditating because they want to develop psychic powers or extraordinary experiences or altered states of consciousness. It's like the devotional religious person's fascination with miracles. They start talking about God and they immediately start talking about miracles that have happened. But I think the regular meditator, the normal meditator, or such a thing, will speak about the fruits of meditation in a quite different way. Not about extraordinary experiences, but about a perceptible but subtle, maybe gradual but perceptible experience of transformation, of an influence of this act of faith, this repeated act of faith that is their daily meditation, on their relationships, especially transforming their relationships, touching their relationships with the spirit of love. So, we saw that faith is, in that sense, and that understanding, is generated and strengthened like a muscle. It's strengthened by the practice of meditation. And it's not unconnected with belief, with our belief systems, but it's not identifiable completely with our beliefs. Our beliefs act as a kind of framework which allow us to maintain our journey of faith. Gives meaning to that journey of faith, or allows us to come back to it. Institutions, I don't go into this, but institutions, religious institutions, maybe medical institutions, tend to embody systems of belief. Those beliefs and rules associated with them may change. In the paper, Catholic News yesterday, the Pope is probably going to change, finally, this rule about divorced and remarried Catholics not being allowed to receive communion. So that's a rule that changes, and it expresses a communal set of beliefs. And so in the same way, institutions serve a useful role. And can we live outside of institutions? If the institutions become unbearable, then we have the freedom to leave them. Or we also have the freedom and maybe the responsibility to remain within them and try to improve them, make the belief system that they embody more compatible with the experience of faith, with the experience of God that they are meant to be facilitating. But we live in a realm of difference. The medieval theologians said that the human condition is living in a land of difference or dissimilarity. So we're different from heaven, from the ideal. We live in an imperfect world, and with many dysfunctions and many failures and many breakdowns. But the act of faith within that imperfect world still has essential meaning. We meditate, for example, in a very imperfect life with many changes, many demands upon us, with many changes of mood and different experiences and different phases of our life. And it isn't easy to maintain that practice on a daily basis. We live in this realm of difference and of unlikeness. But it does represent a very pure commitment to the experience of God, to something central and deep and unchanging within all the changing patterns of our lives. The commitment to meditation, I think, gives us a sense of stability, of centeredness, of continuity, of following a path that we will be following as far as we can see or hope until the end of our life. Thomas Aquinas said, "The act of faith does not find its end in what is expressed in the belief system, but in its object." So, the act of faith connects us directly with the ultimate goal, the ultimate center. And it gives us this sense of direct connection, direct, unmediated connection. The experience of God, I said, often happens within a belief system, and we understand it or express it, articulate it within a certain belief system. But it cannot be identified completely with that belief system. Perhaps we couldn't even begin to speak about it unless we had some language, some framework of belief. The crisis, this cultural and religious crisis today, is that the Christian belief system that is embedded in our culture has a language and associations that for many people are unacceptable or inadequate or unattractive. So they reject all the language, traditional language, because of the associations of it with the institution. But what are we left with then? We have to go scrummaging around for other belief systems, and one of the characteristics of modern culture is that we put little bits and pieces together. We do a sort of a buffet. And maybe where we are, we have to do the best we can with it. But, so this brings us back to the idea that health is more than something we can measure or control, that health is perhaps to be understood only fully within this experience of God that we enter into through a way of faith, a life of faith, not just individual acts, but a way of faith that becomes part of our life. So God is not an object just of our belief system, my God, the Christian God, the Jewish God, the Buddhist ultimate reality or whatever, Allah. But God, in this use of the word, is the real symbol, and its fullness, the fullness of the human being is realized, and that is health, the fullness of life. I've come that you may have life, life in all its fullness, Jesus said. So maybe that's a working definition of health, the fullness of life. That includes every aspect of life.
Could you just repeat, could you go back a little bit?
Where to?
Or just a sentence or two.
What?
Just a sentence or two where you say God is the real symbol.
Oh yeah, God is the real symbol then, not just an object of our belief, an image of God, which is my God, the Christian God, Catholic God, the Bear Island God. But
You have your own God.
we all have our own little God. Yeah. But God is a symbol. The word God is a symbol. I said yesterday it comes from the Sanskrit word for day. So God is a symbol, but it's an effective symbol. You see, when you say the word God, you're already separating yourself from the direct experience of God. On the other hand, we are creatures we need to communicate and to express, and we grow in consciousness by articulating, or trying to articulate our experience. So we use the word God to describe the experience of God as we mature as human beings. Children, I don't think, don't do that. So when you ask a child what they experience in meditation, which may not be a good thing to ask them that too often, but they will simply say, peaceful, I was happy, I felt better. But you can tell that they're describing something very real and very different from their ordinary life. One little boy once said, meditation is the only quiet time I get every day.
Oh.
So anyway, so the experience is there. We later in life try to express or articulate that experience. We use the word God to do that. So God becomes an effective symbol. Now, of course, that word, that symbol can become devalued if it becomes just my God, my little parochial God. And if I embed that symbol too much within the belief system, and especially, of course, if I'm using the word God with a very limited experience of God, that's that's when you really get into trouble, because then God just becomes a concept, an article of belief, and it becomes hijacked by your belief system. And if your belief system is that you can kill people or torture them as a way of being true to God, then you will do that. You'll use God to justify the most inhumane behavior. So, if we keep the word God as this open symbol expressing the experience of God, it has a relationship to our belief system, but it's not swallowed up in our belief system, then it can, I think, help us to understand what the meaning of health is too. Experience with God is what brings us to fullness of life. Jesus said, I've come that you may have fullness of life. And that must include every aspect of life. So it must also include pain, suffering, hemorrhages, and death. The things we were looking at. So life includes those things, doesn't it? It's not the definition of health that we looked at, that we all agreed was a little inadequate. The level of functional or metabolic efficiency of a living organism, free from injury, illness, or pain. Well, that's a pain-free life, whatever that means. And it's an aspect of life, it's a good aspect of life. We would like to be pain-free, but we're not always pain-free. And pain is a significant part of life. And suffering and death are significant parts of life, so we can't exclude them by a definition like that. So Jesus' definition of himself, or his mission, coming to help us into fullness of life, must include this aspect of pain and suffering. That was more than you asked for. Is that clear?
I think yes.
I'm happy to go back over it again.
I think I got the gist.
Yeah, all right. I don't want to hesitate to stop you. Now, what does this experience of God then give us? Or what does it open us to? One of the first things it does, I think, is make us humble. It makes us aware of what we don't know. Makes us aware of a horizon that is of consciousness, a horizon of understanding that is always receding. We live in an expanding universe rather than in a little box where we have labeled every corner of the wall. And that's humility. And you see that humility more often, I think, in scientists than you do in religious leaders. Religious leaders are using these big words like God and love and all this, spirit, and we use these words as if we know what they mean, and we use them very often and very confidently or routinely. But a scientist, a good scientist, is constantly conscious of what he or she doesn't know. Their paradigms and explanations for things are constantly being adjusted. A good doctor, using his or her science, should be humble. Maybe it's not easy for them sometimes to be humble because it means saying to the patient, I don't know what the hell you've got. And I've got actually nothing I can give you which is going to make it better. And they might feel they can't, that probably does make them humble, or maybe it makes them embarrassed, or feeling inadequate, or frustrated. And because they feel the patient is expecting something from them, they're expecting the doctor to be Jesus, to cure them, if not by touching them, but by writing a prescription, then the doctor is going to say, well, I want to fulfill this person's expectations. And that's my job, I want to make them feel confident and give them a sense of authority and so on. So that's part of the dilemma of the caring profession. And do you feel that as a herbalist?
Yeah. Well, you meet it in the sense that people sometimes think herbs are magic.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to explain that sometimes the problem is within the person. And that not all herbs will cure everything, or not any particular herb will cure everything.
Did you tell them that?
Yeah. At times I can be a bit too blunt.
I think humility is the most important attribute any physician can have. It has to be. It has to more and more that I've gone out in my view, because so much we don't know, and you have to be willing to contact colleagues and other specialists and other diagnostics. I agree.
Okay.
I think the hardest, what I find is a difficulty with other herbalists, who sometimes think that herbs are the answer to everything, and that failure to recognise the value of conventional medicine.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge danger for us.
Is there a systematic study of, or do you have a way of understanding how the wisdom of herbology relates to conventional medicine?
Well, yeah, I mean, most of modern drugs are derivations of actual herbs. The main glucophage, going back to diabetes, would be a synthetic extract from one of the main constituents in a herb called goat's rue, which we would give for diabetes. We give other things for diabetes as well.
Would you know, I suppose it's something you have to discern, and doctors would have to do this, conventional doctors would have to do this, when to recommend, herbs and when to recommend, a drug. The situation is too extreme to rely upon slow-acting work of herbs.
Herbs may not necessarily be slow-acting, they can kill quite rapidly.
That's true.
So,
and they cure rapidly.
they can cure rapidly as well. I was intrigued by the hemorrhage case because I had a patient with it, and she emailed me an hour later and she said, how in God's name did that work so fast? So yeah, they can cure quite rapidly. It's the skill is in the knowledge and in the training. The diagnosis. It's and again, I think this is a problem in that you're touching on turning something into a god. I think there is a tendency to turn our plants into gods, and there's a tendency not to be humble as well.
So that, in other words, turn it into an orthodoxy, or in the same way
No,
as...
turning it into that the plant is the answer to everything.
Right.
You know, it's there's humility. There's humility and training and study and research constantly needed. And I think the way forward has to be integration.
Okay, so humility is wisdom. It's an aspect of wisdom. Wisdom, we thought yesterday, is a result of a certain depth or clarity of awareness. So when you see things as they really are, and you see at the lowest level perhaps that the patient has a lot of apple cores under his bed, so that awareness leads to an integrated understanding of the situation, a particular situation to which you can apply general knowledge, general rules, universal principles, without overriding the particularity of the situation. So you balance the particular and the universal. So that's awareness, you could say. So that's what we call wisdom. T.S. Eliot says the only wisdom is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless, he says. The only wisdom is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. So this experience of God then, which opens us to the broader, deeper understanding of health as the fullness of life, one of the fruits of this is humility. Puts things in context, puts things in perspective, connects the bigger and the smaller aspects of a situation, the universal and the particular. And really, every operation of wisdom happens in the here and now. We live in a culture which is constantly trying to create systems that prevent accidents and mistakes and overcome the human factor. Now obviously, to some degree, we want that to be the case with a surgeon or an airline pilot. We want to limit human error as much as possible. But we also can become obsessed with the idea that we could create a computer program that is as big as the universe and contains and controls every possible eventuality, so that we are in a completely safe and secure world, which is clearly not reality. So wisdom also demands, or gives us, a sense of scale and proportion. So that's humility. Well, yes, I can certainly reduce hospital infections by 50% if I get all my doctors to wash their hands properly at all the right times. But I'm still not going to keep everybody alive all the time or prevent some mistakes. So humility is one thing. The other thing that the experience of God gives us, this fullness of life, this experience of health, apatheia of the soul, gives us is freedom. A sense of freedom. You know, it's good to have operating systems that make life convenient and reduce avoidable errors. However, we can create systems, rules, institutions that suck the life out of life and drain us of that feeling of spontaneity, of joy, of quickness of perception, where the individual insight or the individual gift is stifled because it doesn't fit in. So a system, an institution, or a belief system can easily become demonic, really, and life-denying, life-draining. Whereas the experience of God, and I think we could say the meditator brings this into every situation in which they are involved. The experience of God restores life, restores the breath of life to our interactions with other people and to our work. It releases or regenerates an energy of life, spontaneity, creativity, all these other things that actually systems can't very well create. Systems don't make us more creative. They need to be loose enough for creative people to operate, but also strict enough to prevent creative people from, destroying things that work well. So the experience of God makes us humble, and it also sets us free. If we are to think about the possibility of reintroducing the idea of God in this way into our work, into our institutions, if that is feasible, but maybe then we have to communicate. We have to have, first of all, our own understanding of what God means, the experience of God means, and we have to be able to communicate that in a way that doesn't lose us our jobs, because you would get fired pretty quickly if you started talking about God at most of the meetings of, institutions. Yeah. So, and yet, when we're also conscious, though, of the fact that our institutions, this may also include the church, have lost their spiritual dimension for a number of reasons, and there is a fear of anything spiritual because it may be the thin end of the wedge and start to bring in the religious.
Mm-hmm.
And religion is generally regarded as a dangerous thing to bring in to a well-run system or organization. You don't need a religious dimension of understanding to be able to train a airline pilot. You just want to make sure he or she knows exactly how to fly the plane and handle it in difficulties. At the same time, we're conscious that life without the spiritual dimension is less alive and is dysfunctional, easily becomes dysfunctional. And we see, many examples in medicine and in religion and in finance, where institutions become really dysfunctional and counter, sort of self-contradictory. Financial institutions can lead to the bankruptcy of their institution because something is missing. Or lead to a financial global breakdown. You can have a well-run, financially well-run medical system, but in which it's discovered, as in England recently, the patients are being systematically underserved or neglected. So, should we bring, we talk about this later, should we try to bring back how do we describe it, this dimension of human consciousness, human experience that we're talking about here as the experience of God. We need this experience to be fully human. Health is the fullness of human life. It involves, according to the wisdom traditions, a wise ignorance. And this is what is most challenging, I think, to the modern mind. That we cannot allow this experience of God to happen unless we accept there are things we don't know. That there is a way, there's an element, not everything, but there is a significant element in life in which we have to accept a wise ignorance. And this is something you find in all the great religious wisdom traditions and the mystical traditions of religion. Happy is the one who has arrived at infinite ignorance, says Evagrius Ponticus. Well, that would be a great thing to have over the door of a university, rather than over the School of Oriental African Studies in England. Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
So maybe they need to be both there.
What was the quote again? I'm sorry.
No.
Happy is the one who has arrived at infinite ignorance. This is what we call the way of unknowing. This is what we're practicing. Nothing. We're all familiar with it. We practice this when we meditate.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know what we're doing when we meditate? Well, yes and no. But we certainly can't bring the ordinary ways of knowledge, analysis, prediction, control into the time of meditation. We have to say, stay outside, wait a minute, I'll come back to you in half an hour. And this reminds us that the experience of God is not an experience of a thing, of an object. Remember, we can never know God as an object. So, if it's not an experience of a thing, this experience of God, which we all enter into through meditation, then, and other ways, experience of God is not limited to meditation, obviously. That if it's not the experience of a thing, can you say it is an experience of nothing? Of no thing? And is no thing the same as nothing? The Buddhists have a concept of emptiness, sunyata. And emptiness is the English word used to describe what they see as the essential nature of all things, of all reality. Everything is empty at its core, and that has often been interpreted as making Buddhism into a very nihilistic religion. Kind of Nietzschean thing, it's all nothing, it's all. But it isn't. You know, in the book, the Dalai Lama says emptiness does not mean nothingness. So what does it mean? It means quite specifically that the nature of everything is that it is impermanent. And secondly, that everything is interdependent. That's what the word empty means, perhaps it should be another word.
Interdependent.
Interdependent. So nothing exists autonomous and independent. You know, the idea of the totally self-sufficient, emotionally resilient, or I don't know, not resilient, but emotionally neutral person and so on. This idea of independence is illusory. So we are interdependent.
What was the first word? I'm sorry.
The other word was impermanent. Impermanent and interdependent. So, and I think that's a very rational insight. And is there anything you can identify in your life, or of yourself as a whole, that you could say is independent, completely independent? Your moods, your physical well-being, everything about you, your genetic code, everything about you is interdependent. And are you permanent? Well, have a look at your photograph albums. Okay. So, we'll look this afternoon, maybe we have time now, we'll look at death and dying. And if the fullness of life means life in all its fullness, that nothing is excluded from health, then it must include death, which we perceive to be the end of life. But if it is included within life, then it is an end of something, but not the end of life completely. So, the experience of God, which gives us this understanding of health, is an experience of impermanence and of interdependence. If you want to compare that Buddhist idea of emptiness with Christian wisdom and the teaching of Jesus, there's a very direct connection. It's also related to a term that doesn't sound very positive, like emptiness doesn't sound very positive, well, nor does poverty of spirit, the first of the Beatitudes. Happy are the poor of spirit, in spirit. St. Luke says just the poor, but St. Matthew says the poor in spirit. For theirs is the kingdom of God. Well, the kingdom of God must mean fullness, health in its fullness. So, poverty of spirit, I think, expresses, in Christian terms, what the Buddhist means by emptiness and impermanence. And emptiness and impermanence, you could say, are also definitions of a creature. Buddhist avoids talking about creation or creatures because it suggests a creator, and they don't want to get into that. They want to focus upon direct human experience. But the Christian would say, or the Jew, or the Muslim, or many other religions that see the meaning of a personal God, as Etty Hillesum discovered, would say that actually it is, it enriches our knowledge and understanding, our wisdom and our humility, to see ourselves as creatures that are impermanence and are interdependence is our creatureliness, and this actually helps me to understand myself better. Anyway, that's that's more of an interreligious dialogue question. But certainly experientially, that's what we discover when we are healthy. And it helps us to remain healthy, I would say. This is not a specialized experience. It's not reserved for a few mystics or celibate monks or nuns. It's not specialized. It doesn't seem to be restricted to any particular social group or even age group. Although, of course, how the experience is understood and expressed is going to depend upon who you are and how old you are. Nor, interestingly, can you even desire this experience very much. You might spoil it or prevent yourself from entering it if you desire it too much, because you would be bringing too many preconceptions, too many demands and expectations. So John Main says, when you come to meditation, let go of your demands and expectations. Well, it's good to hear that, but it doesn't necessarily mean you do. You can immediately let go of your demands and expectations. That approach, where we are entering into meditation without conditions, without expectations, that takes time. That builds up like the good habit of meditation itself in your daily life. It just becomes an approach, an attitude that grows on you through time, through practice, through faith. But this experience of God, as I say, cannot be restricted to the times of meditation or to those who meditate. It happens, it is happening when you're eating or drinking, sleeping, loving, working, being with someone, giving advice, or doing something stupid, as Raymond Paniker uses all those examples. And it is in the whole spectrum of life that we discover the experience of God. The experience of God, then, is the root of all experience. God is the ground of our being, is what that means. And that must include the pain and the joy of life, the loss and the discovery of life. And yet, there are certain experiences within our lives that seem to bring us into this experience of God more consciously. As we become more conscious of this underlying continuous experience of God, of fundamental health, then we become more and more continuously aware of that experience of God. So it becomes part of your life, your breathing and your sleeping and everything you're doing. It's not an isolated, identifiable experience you can put under the microscope of your analysis. It is simply there, running through, like a vein of gold, running through everything. So, one of those ways in which, one of those particular kinds of experience that make us more conscious, that sort of jolt us into an experience, into understanding the experience of God, is what? Death? Or birth? You see the effect of a birth on a parent or on a family. It's a huge impact, isn't it? Changes the person. And death, similarly, has a huge impact on those who are close to the person who's dying or died. We'll look at that again tomorrow, later. And I would say meditation is also one of those experiences or events or practices, I mean, different from birth or death, because birth and death doesn't happen every day in that way, but meditation can happen every day. And meditation is certainly one of those things that gives us a gentle jolt into becoming conscious of the experience of God in daily life. So it might be music. You love music. Or your work. if you really love your work. Anything that is truly, significant for you, and which calls out of you your deep resources and your commitment or your faith. Anything that calls faith out of you or activates this capacity for faith that we all have. So, having a child certainly makes you more faithful. Being with someone who's dying, strangely, or suffering through a death, strangely also activates this faith dimension. And meditation builds this activation of faith, which is the condition of our experience of God, into daily life in a very deceptively, really simple and ordinary way. This experience of God then, however it comes into us or however we become conscious of it, touches the margins of our lives and makes us question the familiar. It doesn't mean that we don't live in the ordinary. Of course, still get up, have breakfast, oversleep sometimes, do the ordinary things, do the routines, operate within our systems. So we do the ordinary things of life, and yet the ordinary becomes coloured or changed in a way, the way we see it. The margins of the familiar begin to merge into something bigger and more glorious, in fact. There's an expression, Chinese saying, if we, this isn't it actually, where's it gone? Did I quote it yesterday about the bell?
Yeah.
I didn't, did I? Anyway, I can't find it exactly, but it says basically, if a bell is well made, hold your ears, it's going to be loud. If a bell or a gong is well made, however you strike it, it will produce a harmonious and pleasant or integrated sound. So, what is our gong? What does that represent? It represents our consciousness. If our consciousness, if our minds are well forged, well made, then whatever happens to us is going to produce the sound of God, let's say that. Whatever it may be, birth or death, joy or pain, they're going to be different kinds of experience, qualities of experience, but they will all carry the same note, the same tone. So this suggests then that the practice, let's come back to talking about meditation and health, so the practice of meditation opens us to this experience of God in daily life. And as the practice becomes a faithful practice, integrated in the heart of our life, then it begins to form us, forms our consciousness in the same way the well-made gong produces the right tone, or the same tone. Then meditation forms us, reforms us, where we are deformed or too egotistical, or where we have too many blocks, or we have repressions, or we have hang-ups or obsessions and so on. So dysfunctional aspects of the gong of our mind can be repaired and harmonized. We change, and we become better instruments for receiving and communicating the signal of God.
Would this happen if somebody was doing TM?
Yeah, I mean, meditation is meditation. Doesn't matter in that sense in what belief system you're practicing it. However, I mean, I would say, you could say one belief system, this doesn't mean to say all belief systems are equally valid for all people. This is a real difference on this. I mean, like the Dalai Lama would say, I'm a Buddhist. For me, Buddhism is the best religion. But for other people, other religions are better. In a way, you can't argue with that. But not that many people change their religion.
Would it have the same effect? That's what I'm just wondering. Does it lead in the same
Yeah,
direction?
yes, theoretically, yes. I mean, in practical terms, yes. I think so. Yeah. I don't think it means that it's indifferent what tradition you meditate in, what belief system you meditate in. I think you have to meditate within a tradition, within a community, a belief system, if you like, in which you feel most at home. And just to give you an example, I knew a Christian meditator who was invited by a Buddhist group to, with whom she was friendly, to join one of their retreats, because the Buddhist teacher said, so many of the people coming to meditate with us are refugees from Catholicism, or Judaism as well. And they are so screwed up about their former religious heritage that we can't teach them. So maybe it would be helpful if you came and be a sort of a therapist for them, a religious therapist, and help them to get over their bad experiences or memories or bad anger or feeling towards their previous religious affiliation. So I don't think you can just say it doesn't matter any more than you'd say it doesn't matter what country you live in or what language you speak. It does make a difference. You feel at home in certain places and so. But if you but it's not an absolute. It's not an absolute.
There's all meditation, no matter what background it comes from, involve an emptying of the mind.
Sure.
So there first.
Yeah. Well, it's a poverty of spirit, or say an emptying of the mind. Yeah. It's a laying aside of your beliefs. That's not a rejection of your
Do
beliefs.
they all use mantras?
Hmm?
Do they all use mantras?
Well, many. The mantra is a universal meditation discipline or practice, but there are other methods of meditation with breathing or watching your thoughts arise and so on. I think the mantra is the central sort of most normal method of meditation in this way within the biblical traditions. Maybe because of our concept of the Word, God spoke of the Word, the world came to be. The Word came to the prophets, the Word became flesh.
The Buddhists use mantras.
Yes. Yeah. And again, in practical terms, you would take a mantra that is sacred or in your own tradition. And we are in a bit of a dilemma if we approach meditation and we are living in a post-religious world, or we've rejected religion completely. You end up with a situation where a woman wanted to introduce her grandchildren to meditation, but her daughter said, okay, you can teach them to meditate, but no religion. I don't want them touched by religion. Okay, religion is really bad. So this woman had to introduce them to meditation, so she said to them, I can't give them Maranatha because my daughter will find out and she'll say it's a religious word. So she said, choose your own mantra. So the little boy said, I'm going to choose shepherd's pie. And the little girl said, I'm going to choose, because it shows girls are more clever than boys, I'm going to choose dictionary, because it contains all words. So she was stuck with that. But, so I think we do suffer some disadvantages if we have this allergy to religious tradition. Or we have, psychological, I think it's just hang-ons, but valid psychological memory. Somebody who's suffered from abuse in the church is going to have an allergy against Catholic priests. So, understandably. So, but I think if you look at the mystical aspect of religion, that can be healing with regard to the institutional associations in time anyway.
But what if there is a need in people to try to touch base with God, but it's almost a self-sufficiency rather than an acknowledgement of the interdependency which the Church brings.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. People start where they're at. But I think once they start, you don't have to buy into that. If you can see that's where somebody's starting in a very, this is a me, time for me sort of practice, then you don't have to buy into it, you can just accept that's where they're starting from and help them to develop the practice. The question is, do you believe in the practice? I was talking to a couple from a very small but very Catholic country in Europe who were finding a lot of opposition to getting a meditation group started. It's like, and and when they were describing all these difficulties that they had, the rest of the group who were talking about it with kind of amazed. And I said to them, so why do you keep going? And she just looked at us and looked at me and said, I believe in it. Which was a great gift to everybody else in the room, because the way she said it. So, if you believe in it, if you believe in the practice will, I think, expand the person's motivation, and the experience itself will be the teacher.
But maybe it's the tip of the iceberg. You just, and the benefit of the meditation, you can't see that in the person because you maybe only see that person is selfish or something. But maybe it will improve the person's way of dealing with her husband or at work, and you don't know that.
Yeah, I see very few people who are selfish. I think it's
maybe selfish is not the right word. I'm sorry for that.
No. I think it's the issue of self-sufficiency. People have a desire to be self-sufficient. I think it comes from our society where everything is so constrained and we're all boxed into systems that there is this incredible desire to break out, if you like, and not to add any more interdependence or it's a need for silence, I think.
We use this word coping all the time, you know? I'm sure a lot of people come to you and they come to doctors and they go to others and they say, you know, my life is so stressful and so many problems and I don't have time and I don't know how to cope. Well, the idea of self-sufficiency is related to this idea of coping. It's not a bad thing, but at least they're trying to cope, they're not giving up. But maybe they could be helped to understand that coping isn't just about being self-sufficient.
I think it's where I see it as people with depression in particular, especially that racing mind. And it's either looking for the external solution, which would be herbal formula, or trying to change or learn to open themselves up to that ground of being.
So if, so people come to a therapist, to a herbalist, to a physician, or to a priest sometimes, and they're coming with pain, confusion, suffering, a sense of being overwhelmed. You can help them. You could say, it would help you to take this medication, to take these herbs, or it might help you even, if you reconnect to the sacraments. Okay? But at the same time, or the therapist would say, I hope you come back every week. At the same time, at the right time, in the encounter, you can introduce them to meditation. So that, or meditation is part of the universally accepted range of activities, then they wouldn't become, it wouldn't put unrealistic hopes in the medication or the herbs or the therapist or the sacraments. Would that be right?
Yes, part of it is a belief that the solution is out there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the problems, the failure to take responsibility. It's not take responsibility, I think the failure to be aware that we have so much power within ourselves. I think the other thing is that the church rituals, my patients would come from two, maybe three diverse groups. One, they would be incredibly marginalised, some of them. Marginalised both in terms of income and marginalised in terms of belief systems. I would have had quite a few patients who taking dope is normal, so the hallucinogenics would be quite normal. Another subset of patients would be very elderly, would have great faith. That's really physical. And then you have an intermediate group where the church has become, whatever church, has become utterly meaningless. I mean, totally meaningless. And even though they may go to church, it's just a ritual, it's a social event. But there is always that feeling that there is an emptiness out there that they're seeking a solution for. And they tend to attribute a herbal formula with, if you like, some form of magic, but also that failure to accept, it's a rejection as well. It is a rejection of conventional medicine and a rejection of the sheer breadth and wealth of knowledge and health-giving properties and therapies that are out there. So you're dealing with an inherent rejection and you're dealing with vulnerability.
Okay. So, nevertheless, whatever kind of group comes, there are people coming to other people for help.
Yeah.
And they come expecting, you should know a little bit more, you should be able to help me. And not, maybe I'm not putting you on a pedestal, but you've done some study and you've done some work, and can you help me? So, and
That's the easy part.
that's okay. Oh, well, let's come back to that question of the therapeutic relationship. I'm sure when we look at health and health providers, it's not a very nice term, but there always have been in society groups of people who respond to the needs of others in a particular way, whether it's magic or faith or whatever. So how does that relationship happen in the best way today? Maybe that's think about that.
I suppose, I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but I just thought there as you were talking, as a priest, it's probably easy to maybe suggest something in terms of religion and sacraments, whereas I was kind of thinking from medical and cancer, it wouldn't be as easy because, and I just thought that I suppose being mindful and being present and coming at it from that angle and that leading into acceptance, that's probably the only place as a... What would you think? I don't know how anybody else
There's
thinks.
no way you can, to be beyond your scope of practice to suggest religion. If it comes out of the conversation, you touch on their own.
No, I wasn't suggesting. I wasn't suggesting that a therapist or a herbalist should say, go to mass.
No, I didn't think
That will
of
solve all
where.
your problems.
No, I didn't think of
Mother-
where. Yeah, just those kind of...
Go on.
But any more than if they went to well, there's a doctors are probably not going to say take was it goat's root? Goat's root,
Yeah.
What? You make you spend 15 years studying and just telling us to eat some grass. So you go to particular people. I mean, what makes you go to a therapist or a herbalist, a physician, oncologist, or a priest or a monk? A monk would probably recommend something different from a parish priest too. So that connection is part of the mystery of that relationship, isn't it?
Yes,
That
yeah.
they come to you, maybe they're going somewhere else as well. It's like a Irish priest I knew who worked in the Philippines. He would be invited to bless houses of young couples or something. When he arrived, you'd find there was a little trail of blood around the house because they cut a chicken, killed the chicken, and done a kind of a ritual, native religious ritual around it. So they may well, it's like in the same way as if you do surveys on religious practice, it's very difficult to make sense of them very often because the figures don't add up. Which church do you go to or which place of worship do you go to? Because people go to several, or many people, increasing number of people will float around.
Between different religions or different parishes?
Both. Well, but different, not just parishes, but I mean, they'll go. I mean, I met a young person recently who said, they found Mass on a Sunday boring, so they go to a Pentecostal church. And he said it's fantastic. It's joyful. It's an Afro-Caribbean band. It's live. And there's a great meal afterwards. It's social. It's friendly.
Yeah.
And he said, but I don't tell them I meditate. Probably because they wouldn't understand.
There was a time, if you're a Catholic and you went to any other, if you visited an non-Catholic church, remember that it was massively frowned upon your alternative.
There was a priest told me once he had a phone call from this old parishioner just before the Prince Charles and Princess Diana's wedding,
Yeah.
and she said, "Would it be all right for me to watch it on television?" This is it's an Anglican church.
Yeah. But you know the way you said Pope Francis is going to change, maybe going to change the thing about, divorce people and so on. A lot of what's turning people off, I think, from religion nowadays, from the organised church, are the demands to do X, Y, and Z. There's no real reason to it, and I suppose it's just a discipline or something. You have to do this on Sunday. You have to, in the other old days, you have to do something on a Friday. You have to do X, Y, and Z. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
And people don't see that it's.
They don't see the reason for it. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, I think people are looking
Yeah.
for discipline.
Yeah. But is it just a discipline? I mean, they're all
A
man-made rules.
meaningful discipline.
They're man-made rules, and they've nothing to do with what the fundamentals.
I was going to see a film once with a small group of people, and one of them was a Buddhist, and she said, I just have to wake up, I'll be back in 10 minutes. And she went off, and anyway, what she was doing was reciting her mantras, which her teacher had told her you've got to say, I don't know what it was, 10,000 a day or 5,000 a day. And she had to do it. So, if you had met, if that had been a Catholic who said, my priest told me I had to go and say 5 decades of the Rosary, well, it's very similar. But culturally it's completely different because of the associations of the church. But the idea of discipline or practice is not lost. I think people are looking. A young woman said to me once, she'd done a mindfulness course, found it very helpful, and then she came to meditation. She came to it here on Bear Island, actually. And she said, later when I met her, she said, I'm so glad I found a discipline. And I think that's but the problem is, if the discipline is how it's presented, you see it's, what's it there for?
And it's the language we use. I work with a lot of young people who go to spas and detox on a regular basis. And as Christians, we fast.
Oh, yes, interesting.
It's the same concept.
Yes.
It's exactly the same.
Well, same concept, but different motivation, perhaps. See, the fasting would be associated with some kind of self-punishment, especially in the Irish sort of tradition. It's associated with discomfort and pain, isn't it? And it's part of the Jansenism of Irish Catholicism that the more you suffer, the closer you come to God. I mean, maybe it's true also in Latin Catholicism, in the Philippines, where they have this ritual
They
of
weren't
actually
just
crucifying
Protestant
somebody
as the
every
English.
Easter.
They weren't just Protestant as the English. They hadn't got the positive ethic like the English. They weren't infected by that. So
well, the English are not really religious. So they are, but they don't. It doesn't engage them as passionately as
Maybe more deeply spiritual.
so. That's nice of you to say so. Maybe they are, but certainly a different. I think culturally, the English, the Reformation, and the wars of religion for 200 years, the exclusion, the obligation imposed by the Anglican settlement, on everybody to go to church. Didn't matter what you believed. Nobody cared what you believed. It was just that being a Catholic was to be a traitor. So you proved that you were a loyal citizen by going to church. But I think that had a real, just sort of drained the blood out of the religious, spiritual thing.
Probably did out as a Catholic in Ireland too.
Yes.
Really much the same. I mean, minority religions, wherever they are, will be more deep or more convincing
That's very true.
than wherever they are. I mean, Catholics in England will be more religious, presumably, than Catholics in Ireland. Where they'd be more
Yes, maybe.
fighting against it.
I was in Burma in the summer, and the Catholics are 1% of the population, the Christians are 5% of the population. And it's a wonderful community, you know, you really feel, and it's open, it's not, it doesn't have a siege mentality. They're very interested in meditation. They live in a 95% Buddhist country, so they're, you know, they have these images of the Buddha are everywhere. And so when you tell them to sit in a posture of meditation, they just click right into it. The little kids, all like little Buddhas, this perfect back and head down. You know, really, it's amazing. But you know, and I thought there's something to be said for belonging to a minority. You know.
They are not persecuted by the Buddhist church in Myanmar?
No, the Buddhists, well, I say all the Buddhists, but Buddhism, which was made into a state religion by the government, by the military dictatorship, for political reasons, is persecuting the Muslims.
Okay.
It's horrible. And there's a Buddhist monk who's rabble-rousing and actually calling on the Buddhist crowds to attack and kill Muslims. So it's, but the Catholics so far, the Christians so far, they've ignored them really because they're so small. But I went to, you know, it was interesting, I went to one home, a centre, there are about 200 mentally and physically handicapped people. It's the only one of its kind in Burma. It's really surprised me. And it's very primitive conditions, well, very primitive conditions, run by a group of sisters with help. And I thought, and the whole thing was marginal, you know, the people were marginal, the funding was marginal, and yet it had this, it was like a sign, this fantastic sign, and not I mean, it was a great witness to their Christian faith, but it was a sign of, you know, how the way you treat the marginal and the waste products of society, it really defines the society too.
And did the Buddhists have a similar type of structure?
No, I think it was the only one of its kind.
And what did it, how were marginalised, looked after?
Family.
Well, I think either in the home or
Yeah.
I don't know, to be honest. I don't know, but there's a big I don't know. There's a big unmet need there, definitely.
Mm.
Mm.